Detroit, Michigan, June 15, 1958. St. Matthew's Cathedral stands like a Gothic fortress on Woodward Avenue, its stone spires reaching toward heaven, when Sugar Ray Robinson arrives with his bride-to-be, only to have Father McKenna block their path and declare, "I cannot perform mixed marriages in God's house." What happens in the next 3 hours doesn't just save one wedding, it challenges centuries of religious prejudice disguised as holy doctrine. The morning sun streams through 100-year-old stained glass windows, casting rainbow light across marble floors, worn smooth by countless worshippers. Wooden pews stretch in perfect rows toward an altar adorned with white lilies and gold crosses. The scent of incense mingles with the fragrance of wedding flowers. This is where Detroit's Catholic elite celebrate life's most sacred moments, where your union gets blessed or denied based not on love's strength, but on society's prejudices. Robinson stands at the cathedral entrance, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, white bow tie, patent leather shoes that reflect the morning light. 37 years old, multiple world champion, America's most famous athlete. Beside him, radiant in ivory silk and Belgian lace, stands Margaret O'Sullivan, called Maggie by friends. 28 years old, auburn hair, emerald eyes, daughter of Irish immigrants, who built a successful construction business through decades of hard work and sacrifice. They met at a charity dinner 18 months ago. Robinson was the guest speaker. Maggie was volunteering for the Children's Hospital fundraiser. Their conversation lasted until midnight. Their courtship survived family disapproval, public scrutiny, and social pressure from both communities. Now they stand ready to pledge eternal love before God and witnesses. But walking into St. Matthew's Cathedral as an interracial couple in 1958 Detroit means confronting religious authority that places racial purity above divine love, means discovering whether Christian marriage extends to all believers or only those deemed socially acceptable. Father Patrick McKenna intercepts them at the sanctuary doors. 62 years old, 40 years serving Detroit's Catholic community, expert at maintaining church doctrine while managing delicate parish politics. His Irish accent still colors his English after 4 decades in America. His theological training taught him that marriage is sacred, but his cultural upbringing taught him that racial mixing violates natural order. In McKenna's mind, protecting the sanctity of marriage requires careful attention to God's design. Scripture speaks of different peoples, different nations, different tribes. Surely divine wisdom intended these distinctions to be preserved, not blurred through interracial unions that confuse children and challenge social stability. "Mr. Robinson, Miss O'Sullivan," McKenna says, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of Catholic tradition, "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding about today's ceremony." Can you imagine the confusion washing over Robinson and Maggie, standing at the altar of the church where they planned their future, being told there's been misunderstanding about their love? "No misunderstanding, Father," Robinson replies respectfully. "We're here for our wedding ceremony. 2 o'clock is scheduled. Our marriage preparation classes are complete. All documentation is filed." McKenna examines the couple before him. Robinson's obvious wealth and status, Maggie's family standing in the Irish Catholic community, their genuine affection evident in every glance, but none of that changes his fundamental concern about racial intermixing. "Your marriage preparation did not address certain theological complexities," McKenna continues carefully. "The Church teaches that marriage serves God's plan for human flourishing. Mixed unions create difficulties that may not serve divine purposes." Divine purposes, theological complexities. The euphemisms pile up like incense smoke, obscuring the ugly truth beneath religious language. Maggie steps forward, her Irish temper flaring. "Father McKenna, what theological complexity prevents 2 baptized Catholics from receiving the sacrament of marriage? What divine purpose is served by denying love between faithful believers?" The directness catches McKenna off guard. Usually couples accept explanations, look elsewhere for ceremonies, understand the implications without forcing uncomfortable discussions. But Maggie is demanding theological justification for racial prejudice. Picture the tension building in that sacred space, a couple's love confronting institutional barriers that claim divine authority for human prejudices. "Miss O'Sullivan," McKenna responds, "the Church must consider the welfare of potential children. Mixed marriages create identity confusion, social difficulties, challenges that pure unions avoid." Pure unions. The phrase hangs in the cathedral air like a curse disguised as blessing. Robinson's jaw tightens, but his voice remains controlled. "Father, are you suggesting our children would be somehow inferior because their parents love each other across racial lines?" McKenna shifts uncomfortably. "This isn't going according to script. Usually people accept religious authority. Don't challenge theological explanations. Don't force priests to defend racial policies using biblical language." But what McKenna doesn't realize is that he's not just denying a wedding ceremony, He's challenging Robinson's understanding of what Christian love actually means in practice. Mr. Robinson, McKenna continues, this isn't about superiority or inferiority. It's about God's natural order. Scripture speaks of different nations, different peoples. Perhaps divine wisdom intended these distinctions to be maintained. Divine wisdom, natural order, the theological justifications for segregation that sound holy in Sunday sermons, but horrific when applied to actual human love. Robinson looks around the cathedral, sees other couples preparing for ceremonies, white couples whose unions face no theological scrutiny, white couples whose children won't be questioned about divine purpose or natural order. Father McKenna, Robinson says quietly, I notice other couples here today. What makes their marriages align with God's natural order, while ours violates it? The question cuts through religious euphemisms like a sword, forcing McKenna to admit that his concerns about divine purpose only apply when different races seek to marry. Wedding guests begin arriving early. Robinson's family and friends from the boxing world, Maggie's relatives from Detroit's Irish community, two communities that rarely intersect socially, united today by their love for this couple. Can you feel the weight of this moment? Two families watching their children's happiness depend on one priest's interpretation of God's will. McKenna realizes his conversation is becoming public. Parish donors are watching. Church hierarchy might hear about confrontations over racial policies. Community leaders might question his handling of sensitive situations. Perhaps, McKenna suggests diplomatically, there are other venues better suited to your particular circumstances. Churches with different theological perspectives on mixed unions. Different theological perspectives. The suggestion that God's love varies by denomination. That divine blessing depends on finding the right church with the right interpretation of racial mixing. Maggie's family begins gathering around the discussion. Her father, Patrick O'Sullivan, 58 years old, built his construction company through decades of backbreaking work. He didn't approve of his daughter's relationship initially, but Robinson's character and devotion won him over. Father McKenna, Patrick says in his thick brogue, my daughter chose this church for her wedding. She's been a faithful parishioner for 20 years. She's received every sacrament here. What suddenly makes her unworthy of marriage in God's house? The family support adds pressure to McKenna's position. This isn't just about two individuals anymore. It's about a faithful Catholic family being denied church services because of racial prejudice. But Robinson's family arrives too. His mother, Layla, 64 years old, raised her son with deep Baptist faith before he converted to Catholicism for Maggie. She's been skeptical of Catholic rituals, but impressed by the church's emphasis on social justice and human dignity. Excuse me, Father, Layla says politely, but didn't Jesus say something about love being the greatest commandment? About judging people by their hearts instead of their appearances? The biblical challenge from Robinson's mother creates theological pressure from another direction. McKenna facing questions about Christian love from both families. This is where everything changes, where religious authority meets spiritual challenge, where institutional prejudice confronts actual faith. Ladies and gentlemen, McKenna says, trying to regain control. The church has centuries of wisdom about marriage and family life. These decisions aren't made lightly or without theological foundation.
What theological foundation? Asks Dr. Margaret Sullivan, Maggie's aunt, professor of theology at University of Detroit. I've studied church doctrine extensively. Marriage is a sacrament available to all baptized Christians in good standing. What specific theological principle excludes interracial couples? The academic challenge from within the Catholic community adds scholarly weight to the family pressure. McKenna facing theological debate from educated believers. Robinson realizes this moment requires more than personal appeals. He needs to challenge the theological foundations of racial prejudice directly. Father McKenna, Robinson says, his voice carrying through the cathedral, I converted to Catholicism because I was told it teaches that all souls are equal before God, that love transcends earthly divisions, that marriage is a holy sacrament reflecting Christ's love for his church. He pauses, letting the theological language settle. Are you now telling me that church doctrine places racial separation above divine love? That God's sacraments aren't available to all faithful believers? That my soul is somehow less worthy of blessing because of my skin color? The questions echo through the cathedral like prayers seeking answers, forcing McKenna to choose between racial prejudice and theological consistency. Can you imagine the power reverberating through that sacred space? A boxing champion using theological arguments to challenge religious discrimination. Other wedding parties are stopping their preparations to listen. Couples from different ceremonies gathering to witness this confrontation between love and prejudice playing out before the altar. McKenna looks desperately toward the parish office, hoping for backup that doesn't come. He's been backed into a theological corner by Robinson's relentless logic and can't defend racial policies using biblical language.
But then something unexpected happens. Bishop Thomas Flanagan emerges from the sacristy, having heard the discussion from his preparation room. 68 years old, leader of Detroit's Catholic community, theologian who spent decades studying marriage doctrine. What seems to be the difficulty here? Flanagan asks with Episcopal authority. McKenna explains the situation quickly. Mixed marriage request, theological concerns, community considerations, social complications. Flanagan listens carefully, then examines Robinson and Maggie, sees their obvious devotion, notes their completed marriage preparation, reviews their baptismal certificates and parish records. Father McKenna, Flanagan says quietly, what specific church doctrine prohibits marriage between two baptized Catholics in good standing? The Episcopal question creates immediate pressure. McKenna can't cite official doctrine that doesn't exist, can't claim theological authority he doesn't possess. Bishop, there are pastoral concerns, community reactions, social difficulties. Social difficulties, Flanagan interrupts, are not theological objections. Are these two people properly prepared for marriage according to church requirements? Yes, Bishop. But are they baptized Catholics living according to church teachings? Yes, Bishop. But the racial mixing is not a matter of church doctrine, Flanagan concludes firmly. Marriage is a sacrament available to all qualified Catholics. Personal preferences about race don't supersede sacramental theology. The Episcopal authority settles the theological debate immediately. McKenna's racial objections crumble under actual church doctrine. But Flanagan isn't finished making his point. Mr. Robinson, Miss O'Sullivan, he continues, the Catholic Church teaches that marriage reflects God's love for humanity, that sacramental union transcends earthly divisions, that divine blessing extends to all faithful believers regardless of race, nationality, or social status. He turns to address the gathering crowd. Today you witness the power of sacramental love overcoming human prejudice. This union represents everything the Church teaches about marriage, transcending worldly barriers. The bishop's endorsement transforms the ceremony from controversial to celebrated. What began as confrontation becomes affirmation of Catholic teaching about universal love. McKenna, chagrined but obedient to Episcopal authority, agrees to perform the ceremony, not because his racial attitudes changed, but because church hierarchy clarified official doctrine. The wedding proceeds with unusual significance. Two families united across racial lines, two communities celebrating love transcending barriers, two people proving that divine blessing doesn't depend on social approval. The ceremony itself becomes more meaningful because of the struggle preceding it. Vows spoken under pressure carry extra weight. Rings exchanged after confrontation symbolize stronger commitment. Blessing received despite opposition feels more precious. Robinson and Maggie's first kiss as married couple draws spontaneous applause from gathered witnesses who understand they've seen more than a wedding. They've seen love triumph over institutional prejudice. The reception that follows creates unusual community integration. Boxing world celebrities mixing with Irish construction workers, Protestant relatives sharing tables with Catholic parishioners, racial boundaries dissolving in celebration of successful love. What happened in those 3 hours changed more than two lives. It established precedent for interracial Catholic marriages in Detroit. Other couples facing similar resistance could point to Bishop Flanagan's theological clarification. Within 6 months, St. Matthew's performed dozen more interracial ceremonies, not because attitudes changed overnight, but because official church position was clarified publicly. Policy trumped prejudice when Episcopal authority supported doctrinal consistency. Other Catholic parishes across Detroit heard about the Flanagan decision. Progressive priests felt empowered to perform interracial ceremonies. Conservative priests couldn't cite theological objections that bishops had already dismissed. The Robinson wedding became case study in Catholic seminaries. How to handle conflicts between personal prejudice and official doctrine. How to apply sacramental theology consistently across racial lines. National Catholic publications featured the story. America magazine ran editorial about marriage transcending racial boundaries. Commonweal discussed theological implications of integrated sacraments. Robinson and Maggie's marriage itself thrived despite early social pressure. Their children grew up bilingual, bicultural, comfortable navigating both communities. Their success validated every argument about love transcending racial barriers. Years later, when civil rights protests intensified, Robinson would reference his wedding experience as example of institutional change through theological consistency, challenging religious authority with religious principles, using doctrine to defeat discrimination. The strategy influenced other civil rights approaches. Instead of attacking religious institutions, reformers began demanding consistency between stated beliefs and actual practices. Using theological arguments to support integration, Robinson understood something powerful that morning at St. Matthew's. Sometimes the most important fights aren't in boxing rings or political arenas. They're in sacred spaces where institutions claim divine authority for human prejudices. The victory wasn't just about one couple's wedding. It was about proving that religious faith, properly understood, supports human equality rather than racial separation. That divine love transcends earthly boundaries. Think about institutions in your community that claim moral authority, religious organizations, educational institutions, civic groups that profess inclusive values while practicing exclusive policies. Because 3 hours of theological consistency can change institutional cultures, can prove that stated principles must apply universally or lose moral credibility, can demonstrate that love, blessed by proper authority, overcomes prejudice disguised as principle. Robinson and Maggie didn't just get married that day. They proved that divine blessing extends to all faithful believers regardless of race. That sacramental love transcends human boundaries. That theological consistency defeats religious prejudice when properly applied.